Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Capital Deployment and Commercialization Strategy Day, our final live content day of the LS6 World Congress. We have our next panel, I guess, following on from some conversations which were had on the previous panel, in fact, looking at first launch and commercialization. So this ongoing trend and the drivers behind companies being able to, rather than partner up, go it alone and launch their products themselves. Delighted to be joined by a fantastic lineup of companies with experience in this commercialization process. I know we'll have a lot of talking points and discussion points that we've already prepared, but please do keep your questions coming in as you have done for the rest of the event in the Q&A and chat functions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as we go through firstly the presentation and then indeed the panel session that will follow. But for now, I'll hand you over to our presenter and moderator for today's session, Ben Hone with ZS or ZS, as I'm sure you call it. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Welcome, everybody. So today we're going to talk about emerging pharma first launch and commercialization with a spotlight on oncology and rare disease launches, as well as looking at the EU landscape of first launches. So we've got an amazing panel lined up as well for a discussion. The format's going to be, we're going to do some introductions, then a presentation, approximately 20-ish minutes to take you through some data, trends, benchmarks, hit the highlights of those, and then we'll move into a panel discussion and Q&A. Look forward to questions throughout the presentation and the discussion in the chat as well. So let me just do a quick introduction of myself, and then I'll ask each of our panelists to do the same. I'm Ben Hone. I'm a principal with ZS Associates, 25 years working in the life sciences industry as a consultant, and with most of that focused on helping companies at the intersection of new product development and commercialization. In the last decade in particular, working with emerging pharma and smaller biotechs, and speaking and writing on the topic of first launch and partnering for the last 5 years or so. We track data on all the first launches, and some of what we'll be presenting today is based on that, looking at the first launches from 2011 through 2020. A lot more detail than we're going to hit in the presentation today. We'll hit the highlights, so feel free to email me at ben.hone@zs.com if we can provide more information or you'd like to go deeper in any of these topic areas. Liz, can you hand it to you for a quick intro as well?
Sure. Hi, Ben, and thanks for having me. I'm excited about the panel and a very, very opportune time for us. We just launched our first medicine this past year during the pandemic. I'm Liz Barrett, President and CEO of UroGen Pharma. We're focused on uro-oncology products, so urologic oncology. I just spent the last 25 years in big pharma and companies like Pfizer and Novartis. I'm thrilled to be here. I say I was finally liberated and moved over to the biotech side, but after doing many launches over the years, we had our first launch this year. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Nassim? Oh, you're on mute, Nassim.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me on the panel as well. Really looking forward to the presentation discussions. By background, I'm a physician by training, 30 years in the biotech space, predominantly in orphan diseases. I was at Genzyme and Biogen IDEC during the period when they developed a large number of orphan products. Most recently, I'm the CEO of Orphalan, a company based out of Paris, which went through both the development and launch of the product in Europe. And also, we're now filing our NDA in the US in a rare orphan disease called Wilson's disease. And happy in the discussion panel session to talk about our experience in Europe over the last couple of years, what went well and what maybe we could have done better.
Kiernan?
Ben, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel today. My name is Kieran Rooney. I head up corporate business development at Amryt Pharma. I'm a pharmacist by training, PhD pharmacologist, worked in academia for a number of years, prior to moving into the embryonic CRO sector back in the late 1980s. Spent a bit of time in clinical development before moving into corporate and business development. I've been in BD now, I guess, for over 25 years, and spent a lot of time in the last 20 years really helping companies build their corporate strategy, and ran a consulting business for 10 years working with multinational farmers, mid-sized farmers, orphan disease pharma companies, and also emerging biotechs, doing a lot of work for investors. I was a consultant at PricewaterhouseCoopers for 5 years. Amaret is a rare orphan disease company. We are relatively new, kids on the block. We've been around since 2015, although for the first year, effectively, we were in stealth mode. We came out of stealth in 2016, and we've always wanted to be a commercial entity. We became commercial pretty soon thereafter, acquired European rights to an asset from Agerion Pharmaceuticals, an asset called Lojuxta for homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Turned that asset around, doubled revenues in the first 18 months. That didn't go unnoticed by the bondholders at Agerion, and we acquired the mother company, if you like, in 2019, and we've just had the first positive readout ever in a phase 3 study for the treatment of epidermolysis bullosa. So look forward to the discussions today.
Fantastic, thank you. With that, we'll move into sharing some of the overview of first launches. So as I mentioned, so what is a first launch? We've been analyzing this, and in order to build out our universe and dive in, we've defined it as a first marketed asset launched by a company, either by itself or with a co-promote partner. For this exercise, we're going to focus on novel first launches. And so to do that, starting with looking at from the US side, we looked at a universe of 1,400 launches defined by the FDA as either novel drug approvals or a BLA approved by CBER. And of those, we found 66 that qualified for our definition of a novel first launch between 2011 and 2020. Separately, we're going to look at launches, not today, but separately we'll look at launches through the 505(b)(2) pathway, as well as there are quite a number of novel ones that come through that mechanism in the US as well, including some that launched in the last year. But for 2020, using this novel definition, there were 11 in the US across a range of therapeutic areas. Interestingly, the number of first launches is continuing to look strong. I've got a slide up just on overall novel drug approvals. This is total for the whole universe, including emerging pharma. And we saw basically a similar number of expedited approvals and total FDA approvals in the US, with 59 of those being novel across a variety of therapeutic areas, notably oncology and dermatology, systemic anti-infectives being the top 2 therapeutic areas, with CNS third overall. When you look at those that are first launches, oncology is even more overrepresented, with CNS in 2020 being the second largest category. We are going to dive in separately to looking at the rare disease. The rare disease cuts across obviously all of these therapeutic areas. Interestingly, that over of those first launches, about 14% were co-promotes in the US. And of those that also launched in Europe, which was a subset of about 29 out of the 66, 40% went alone, and 55% out-licensed for Europe. Only one co-promote. Looking into the oncology component of those first launches, so the biggest therapeutic area, there are 19 oncology first launches over this time frame, with 4 of those being recently in 2020. Within the oncology space in the US, 80% go it alone versus about 20% co-promoting. And of those then that launched in Europe, 30% managed to launch on their own, and versus 70% out licensing for their European first launch. I think one of the things that's been driving the ecosystem and investment in emerging biotechs has been some of the spectacular exit values that we've been seeing for companies that have actually gone to the commercialization stage, particularly so in oncology, where if you look at those companies that exited after a first launch, the acquisition value was almost $10 billion on average across those. One of the common questions that companies ask when they're considering commercializing is, how much am I going to have to spend to commercialize? How many reps am I going to need? Because the field team tends to be your number one investment line item when you're thinking about preparing for a launch and launching. And we pulled that data. So one of the nice things about publicly traded first launch companies is they're easier to benchmark because they're, essentially you don't have the multi-asset portfolio. You've got, usually there's one lead asset, and usually you can read a fair amount into the publicly disclosed financial data for those that are public. And we track both revenue, field team sizes, as well as that SG&A spend the year before and the year after launch. And it is a significant investment. Typically in oncology, what we're seeing is 40 to 85 roughly for a field team. Co-promote teams tend to be larger, so upwards to 150. 125 in the case of a co-promote team. I think good news, we do this every year when we run this analysis, is look forward to anticipate is some of these trends for first launch going to continue into the future. And there is a as healthy a roster of companies that have the potential to be first launches in the future, as we've seen in any of the prior years with those on the filed column on the right, as well as a very healthy phase 3 trial universe in oncology on the left. We've kind of also highlighted kind of which ones have partnered already at this stage versus a fairly sizable group that aren't boxed there that have still have not yet partnered outside of the U.S. When you look at the rare disease landscape outside of oncology, so within oncology, most of those launches are orphan assets. Many of them are also very rare or ultra rare. But outside of oncology, we identified 16 that were novel rare disease first launches, with a reasonable mix across those that were at the larger end of the orphan category, so 100 to 2,000 patients, versus very rare and ultra rare. And I think these are not necessarily universally accepted definitions, but more ZS definitions about how we think about ultra rare, very rare. Within the ultra rare category, I think what we've seen is there have been very viable launches with even within that space. It gets a little challenging when you get down into the sub 1,000 level patient population sometimes, but certainly compared to 10 or 20 years ago, the definition of a viable patient population has certainly changed, and we certainly see those 5,000 to 10,000 to 15,000 patient population diseases as areas of interest. So in the rare disease space, we saw a slightly lower ratio, not surprisingly, of co-promotion versus going it alone. Usually the target audience is smaller, more well-defined, so there may be less economic incentive to do a co-promotion. And of those that launched in Europe, about 44% did a solo launch versus an almost similar amount that out-licensed for Europe. Smaller number, though, of exit values post-launch. A couple of these very healthy, but not the same level as what we've seen in oncology. Similarly, field team sizes, roughly half of what we've seen in terms of the typical field team size in oncology. Spend levels, though, proportionately lower, though still quite significant. Let's look just a little bit at the EU landscape. So over 800 companies we identified as focusing on novel therapeutic development, with the UK, France, Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden accounting for about 62% of the emerging pharma landscape. And of those, about 30% of these companies have one marketed asset, while the remainder have assets in clinical development and potential to be future first launch companies. The majority of these are in oncology, followed by anti-infectives and CNS, but notably, we've seen a significant growth in the cell and gene therapy, immunotherapy, and vaccine areas in the European landscape in terms of pipeline activity. So when we look at first launches in Europe, so companies that did their first launch in the European market, we identified 19 of these, of which 13 were European-based companies. Interestingly, that there were 6 not based in Europe, but launched for the first time in Europe out of that universe. And within that, there was a healthy proportion of rare disease launches represented. Approximately 40% of these have been for orphan indications using the EU definition. And what we've seen is that roughly paralleling the increase in orphan approvals in Europe over that time frame. So of those 13 products, they all went alone, and those that did launch in the US as well out-licensed. So it's a little bit of a simpler story there. I think we do see some key differences. I'm not going to go into the detail between these two, between a European and a US launch. There's certainly reimbursement landscape, and navigating the reimbursement landscape is seen as potentially a more complex thing to do in Europe. And that's, I think, a topic some of our speakers are going to touch on. So, when companies, when C-suite and boards start to think about should I commercialize on our own versus partner, I think one takeaway is for publicly traded companies, you're almost always on a parallel path, whether you like it or not. So even if your strategy is to look for a licensing partner, or your strategy is to stay and become a commercial stage company, depending on offers received at various points in time during development, you may or may not be on your chosen path, and you need to prepare for the alternatives at all times moving forward. But companies thinking about launching on their own often start with, can we? They want to know how, what have other companies done? They want to understand, should we partner in Asia or Europe? And they want to understand, what do we need to do to prepare? So both what are the best practices, as well as what are kind of table stakes things that we have to do if we're going to commercialize on our own. Often what we see is companies starting, or we help companies with an initial phase of launch preparation, strategy and planning that cuts across customer insight, marketing, understanding the global opportunity and valuation, thinking about your commercial, both headquarters and field organization build, access and value, and then partnering strategy. And these are all somewhat interrelated in that, commercial impacts your budget significantly. Your access and pricing is a key driver often for partnering, as well as your overall valuation. And then increasingly thinking about the data analytics and technology as part of the build is a core competency that's required to commercialize successfully. So with that, I'm going to turn it back. We're going to ask some questions of our key audience, and look forward to questions as well coming through from the chat. Thank you. And let's see here. Let me just put up I'm going to go back to the beginning and just put up our speakers again for anyone that may have joined late, so you know who we have on our panel. Liz, maybe we can start with you. When you were thinking about your first launch, was there anything in particular that you were concerned about, or what were the top questions on your mind as you were thinking about whether you should launch this yourself? Was it even a question for you to launch yourself? And if so, what were the key questions and concerns you had?
It's a great question. I would say I was probably hired into the company as a CEO 2 years ago because we would launch ourselves. I think many people know that my background is commercial. I've run, global businesses, but spent a lot of time in commercial. So I think there are a couple things to consider, and you actually touched on them. The important thing about this is you actually can launch very efficiently. So if you're able in oncology and rare disease to have the types of sales teams that you talked about, for us as an example, we only need 48 sales reps to actually cover 80% of the patient population. So that is a very much a driving factor in determining whether to do it yourselves or not. I think the second is, do you have the expertise? And luckily, I can't take credit for it, but we had attracted some top talent in this space. So we knew this space. Our head of commercial, is very clearly knows personally a lot of the physicians. And so those were the types of things. Can we do it? You hear often about biotechs, quote unquote, short the launch because they believe biotech companies cannot launch effectively. I think you've proven by your information that we actually can. So far, so good as far as we're concerned. But I think that's part of it. And I think the last piece is about value. We need to keep the value into our company for our shareholders. And so it's, we also are launching a rare disease in oncology. So it's for upper tract urothelial cancer, which is only about 6,000 to 7,000 patients. So when you start to think about that, we can do it in the U.S., we have the expertise, we can do it efficiently, and we want to maintain the value in our company.
Great. Naseem, let me turn it to you and ask you a similar, kind of question. How do you think about this? Should we or shouldn't we, think about launching ourselves? And remember to be off mute.
Let me do that. So good question. I think when we were looking at one of your label products to launch in Europe, and we started in Europe as opposed to coming from the US to Europe, we had a somewhat of an initial daunting task. Yes, we had the EMA approval, but then we needed to go through the pricing reimbursement process country by country, and it's individualized and a different timeline and different pressures in the market. So we had to really pick and choose. That worked in our advantage because I think, as Liz said, you can do it yourself. And we said, let's look at it country by country. So Germany, we were fortunate to be able to get pricing first. And so we built up our commercial organization over the last 18, 24 months. And touch wood, so far, with a great team that's been very successful. And we're now in 13 of the markets, which which are probably about 90% of the attractive reimbursable markets in Europe. And we've been able to do that de novo ourselves because the timelines were staggered and we could build the organization. And we were very fortunate we could fund it ourselves. We didn't need to go to further to the venture capitalists. Just by the intrinsic revenue and profitability, we were able to do that. And from that, we've now springboarding to, we've set up our own establishment in Latin America, in Brazil. We're looking to do that in Australia, New Zealand, Middle East, and then the US. And that has been because we wanted to, as Liz said, retain the value for our shareholders. And that was by retaining the rights. And we are in that ultra orphan area. We have about 1,000 eligible patients in Europe that we are targeting, and we've been able to do that and build an organization of under 50 people to deliver that.
That's fantastic. Great. Kieran, can you answer a similar question for us? How are you thinking about first launch?
Yeah, I guess we're somewhat different, Ben. We became commercial by stealth, by acquisition. So, we had we've always been a highly acquisitory organization, and we did something that was I think most people would have thought as challenging. So we came out of stealth mode by acquiring two companies and reversing into an oil and gas shell exploration company to get onto the AIM market in the UK, which fortune favors the brave, I guess. We had always planned to be commercial. So one of the assets that we picked up from one of our acquisitions, was actually already approved, and we chose not to launch that because it wasn't it was approved. This is an asset that we acquired from a German R&D company. They'd taken it through 3 phase 3 studies in Europe and got it approved for partial thickness wounds. And we're a rare disease company, so we chose not to launch in that indication, and we pivoted into epidermolysis bullosa. So we going back, this is 2016, we were thinking about, what's our commercialization strategy going to be for this asset, and we always planned to do it ourselves. But then, fortuitously, we acquired a European commercial infrastructure through the acquisition of Lojuxta out of Agerion. So that gave us boots on the ground straight away. But the first thing you have to do then is, there's a reason that companies exit Europe, and that's usually because it is a spectacularly challenging, or can be a spectacularly challenging place, to Nassim's point, to actually get your pricing and reimbursement correct and to put the right level of resource into it. So we had to, when we acquired the asset from Agerion, we had to right size that business. We had to put the appropriate boots on the ground. We had to change partnerships. It was very much a kind of a hybrid model that we'd adopted. Some places we were going through distributors, some territories we actually had the boots on the ground. But as we built around that, I guess we adopt that kind of Pareto principle as the 80-20. Where your key markets are, where you're going to be able to drive the opportunity, where the patients are. So, the example that we always give is that there are as many patients in the King Faisal Hospital in Riyadh with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia as there are in either Germany or in the UK. So clearly you target those areas, and some of those areas can be more challenging when it comes to building commercial infrastructure. So again, we've kind of adopted a hybrid model there, and been quite successful in doing that. So it's always, I guess, the way we've approached it is, put your toe in the water, see what it's like, see what it actually takes to commercialize an asset in a particular country. And then, once you get to that kind of critical pivot point where things are going well, then you actually put your own boots on the ground at that point in time. I always think that, Europe is as I've already alluded to, Europe's a challenging place from a pricing and reimbursement perspective. And, there's a number of companies who've, done their first launch here in Europe, US organizations who've come over here and built pretty big infrastructures, but then realized that it's actually scarier than they actually originally realized or anticipated, and as a consequence have exited it. If you look at what Ariad did back in the day, they sold their business to Incyte. If an example that you gave earlier on was Axia. Axia was looking to build a commercial infrastructure here in Europe, and only very recently they put out a press release. Well, there was an update investor day saying that they had actually exited the European space, and following the Ionis acquisition, and licensed those assets to Sobi. So whilst fortune favors the brave, you really have to know what you're doing when you're coming into Europe.
Right, and you can't always foresee those areas. It's a good example with a post-approval, even early commercial discovery that a clinical event that caused you to have a smaller label than originally anticipated. So your whole opportunity changes. So it's a lesson there.
And I think it also depends what else is going on in the broader world as well within your organization. So if there's other stuff going on at the mothership, out of the US, then it's all about bandwidth. It's what you can focus on, and your ability to, whilst Europe is, or historically was, easy to get to on a plane, not quite so straightforward nowadays. It's a very, very different place to commercialize assets.
There's a question from the chat that says, considering the complexity in Europe, 26 individual countries in the EU and more outside, isn't it going to be better to partner rather than to launch yourself? And I think it's a very common question. I think it's on the top 5 questions. And I think there's sometimes a point of view, and Liz, I'm curious your perspective on this, but I think there's sometimes a point of view on it depends in the short term versus the longer term. And I think if you're looking at the immediate NPV, you might have one kind of answer. If you're looking at a portfolio and thinking about building something for the future, you may see that more as an investment in a foundation for the longer term. Liz, thoughts on that question?
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. We struggle with that right now. Our product, we can get it approved in Europe, but the problem is that because they're pricing and reimbursement, some countries we won't even be able to cover our cost of goods. So you have those challenges. I think when I think about Europe, and we also right now are considering, do we go it along or do we partner? It is exactly what you said. You want to put the investment in. Interestingly enough, even despite the fact that there's so many different countries, you can still commercialize in Europe fairly efficiently. From a standpoint, there's things you can share across country. You don't need as many representatives in each individual country. For me, it's more about expertise, right? And you have to be able to hire the right talent that can get your medicines reimbursed at a value rate, right? And anything you do in Europe has global implications, particularly from a pricing and reimbursement standpoint. So for me, it's a lot about that. I think you can put the investment in. To your point about long term, I do think that makes a difference. If you've got one drug and only expect to have one drug, it probably makes no sense at all. Is there a company that actually, is expert in these areas in your area, particularly for us, like uro-oncology? If you have a company that you're able to partner with that you believe can be successful, and partnering probably is the better route to go. But look, there's a lot of different elements to take into consideration.
And Nassim, I know you're looking even beyond Europe, so that calculus is probably amplified. I know, having looked at the same question in terms of the first launches that also first launch in Japan, it's pretty hard to find any, and there, some distribution and other barriers that make that a high. Even like a Celgene went to Japan after the Abraxas acquisitions. They were a big player by the time they went there. So, I think, I'm curious how you're thinking about this, even when you go beyond the top markets like U.S., Europe, Japan, and China.
So I hope it's not hubris. I don't think it is, but and maybe because I grew up in Genzyme and saw how you can do it. And I think you have to look at Europe not as Europe, but you have to look at it country by country. So you have the centralized approval, and then after that, it's very much tactical. And I think to Liz's point, it's about people. And if you have a product with a very significant unmet need and it's differentiated and physicians and patients need it, I believe there is a pathway if you do it right. And that means first and foremost, having the right people. And we may have been lucky because, we didn't need to use recruiters. I looked within the Genzyme Biogen family, and there's a network of people who wanted to become entrepreneurial when those companies got acquired. And so we reached into that network of deep experience and dealing with those very tactical local issues. But I can recognize that, if you're a company in the US, that's the biggest market, and then you think you're going to come in and do that in Europe, you could easily trip up because you don't have that network of people, and you can't navigate the complexity. If you can navigate that, I think there is an opportunity.
That's great. And Liz, maybe this one for you. there was a question on the chat about launching in COVID, and are we going to, think about things differently coming out of COVID? If I recall correctly, you had an approval roughly 2 months into the pandemic, so lots of time to think about preparing for COVID, right?
Yeah, you sort of look back and you say, okay, what did I just spend the last 18 months doing, right? We throw it out the window, but we actually really didn't throw it out the window. I think one of the things, the preparation that we did up to prepare for launch really helped us when we launched, because physicians wanted to talk to us, and it's sort of, you have the giver and the receiver. What was happening in the pandemic is we were all impacted by it. What I mean by that is physicians and physician offices were impacted just as we were. So we were able to have Zoom 101 meetings, and physicians had time, I would say, unfortunately, in some cases, because they weren't seeing as many patients and patients weren't coming in. I think that one thing I was very concerned about and talked a lot about in the beginning of the pandemic was patients refusing to come in, or people not feeling well and not going in to see their doctor. And actually, cancer diagnosis was down as much as 40 to 50% during the beginning of the pandemic. And so I think we all did, as well as a lot of the cancer centers, did a good job of educating people and encouraging them to come in and ensuring them that they had put the right things in place. But basically what we did is we took some of our tactics that we had planned and we took them virtual. A lot of the medical meetings, we had the big medical meeting for us was happening in May. They took that virtual. We sent out a virtual booth. So we did a mailing, and, it allowed physicians to experience what you would have been able to experience, otherwise. We've gone from speaker programs, live speaker programs, to actually Zoom speaker programs. And I think the most important thing that everybody's looking forward to is, having a little bit of a balance. But I think the question about will we ever go back to kind of just the old way of doing things, I think no. I think we've learned a lot. I think what's happened is for the last 10 years, digital has always been one of the things we always talk about, but we tiptoe into it. We keep all of the same tactics we had, and we do a little bit of digital and a little bit of digital here. And I think now you'll see more of a balance with that. But, having said that, I still believe that it's really important to have the representatives, our nurse educators, in with the doctor, particularly in the beginning, because and especially in a rare disease standpoint, because we have so few patients, you kind of need to be in there when the patients are going in. So you need to kind of be that reminder. So we're looking forward to a time where physician offices are more open. But we were fortunate enough that we had a drug that physicians were starting to hear about. They were interested, and so we could get the amount of time we needed to really build that education and awareness. And we've actually seen our awareness up to 90+%, right after launch, which is, as with all the work that you do, is really unheard of.
It's spectacular. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a very interesting question. It's one we've done a lot of research on as well. We've actually published quite a bit on the ZS.com, or ZS, I should say, for our European colleagues' website as well. Let me just ask about the same question, kind of COVID from those of you in Europe. Nassim, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So there were a couple of very interesting phenomena we saw. So when it hit in March, we saw an immediate, probably about a 50% decline in volume. And I thought, okay, patients are not going out to get a prescription. And actually, it took almost a year, 9 months, 10 months, before we started seeing that ramp up. And the only thing we can think from a patient perspective is we know they're not compliant, especially for an oral lifetime medication. And they probably had a fair amount of stock in the house. And they started using that up. And it took a significant amount of time. The other thing we saw was, a significant ramp up in engagement, as we were saying, online. And when I looked at the utilization of webinars and education, it went from, initially 30 to the last one was 170 physicians attending our webinar. And The other thing we started seeing that is now that is a vehicle, an interesting vehicle, where we could bring people in to talk about what are the things you collectively want to do. And we started seeing in terms of clinical studies, we asked them what your areas of interests are. And there were things that common themes that occurred. And then through those webinars, we started planning clinical trials and who wants to be involved in a clinical trial. Well, is a phase 4 label expansion trial. And we had like a hit rate of like 50% wanted to be engaged in trial. Then you can go to the next level and say, how many patients do you have and how much do you want to engage? So to Liz's point, I think it's going to change some in ways we communicate and bring people together as communities in these orphan diseases, physicians. But I do think that to Liz's point, this is a very high medical touch point segment. And often you're the first in the market. And so that we kept all our organization, we upgraded and used a lot of that time for training. Yeah. And we expect when, we're beyond this, they will be out there again.
We did notice with data with looking at MSL engagement versus other field team member engagement, we did see that while it went down slightly versus pre-COVID, it was like 80% levels where you saw higher drop off with other field team members in terms of that receptivity to engage. And one of the so we did see in oncology, for example, you might bump up your MSL team. So maybe you had 8, now you're gonna have 12. That was one. So it was kind of at the margins, thinking about dialing up in some areas, dialing down in some areas, but not wholesale changes. We didn't see anyone say, hey, we don't need the other field team members. Just maybe around at the edges, you dial it back a little bit and do more virtual. There's really a fourth channel, I think, that has emerged, which we're calling VPE, or virtual personal engagement, to complement the face-to-face and the non-personal and the digital. And it's one, when you step back and think about it, is already common in customer engagement processes and activities in other industries. Very common in high tech, for example, and B2B relationships. And I think what you're going to see is potentially that will be part of a mix. I think the uncertainty is we saw very different levels of VPE across specialties during COVID. Rheumatologists, unbelievably, were the most likely to engage virtually of any specialty, for an interesting tidbit. But we do expect, that'll drop back some as the face-to-face opens up more. And the other thing, I think, is people figuring out how to make those virtual engagements really valuable 2 ways. Otherwise, you see a drop off fairly quickly when you do get the engagement. Kieran, any thoughts on this question around, COVID and engagement?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and somewhat counterintuitively, we actually saw our sales increase last year. So we've been guiding the markets quite significantly north of where we were on a pro forma basis in the previous year. So 2020 was actually, again, counterintuitively, a really good year for us. But I think there's a kind of a bit of a lag period between 2019 into 2020. So you get in a lot of it, it's all about finding patients, this game. In the ultra rare patients, one patient can make a big difference. So your MSL's going out there and it's very much a medical affairs driven commercial angle there. So getting guys going out there doing the good work at the tail end of 2019 into early 2020, digging these patients out from wherever they've been hiding away, bringing those patients in, and then working in that kind of virtual way to make sure that the patients had access to their medications, because the two indications we play to, homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia and generalized or partial lipodystrophy, are pretty, the impact of those on a patient is very, very significant. So yes, compliance or adherence is not always 100%, but these guys want to make sure that they get their meds and will go out of their way. And our team as well, really going out of their way to make sure that the patients are still receiving their meds, despite the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we took a look at launches during 2019. We stepped back in September and said, if we look back over the last 6 months and look at those launches, did they over or underperform versus forecast? And with the caveat that I think the number one reason launches over or underperform versus forecast is usually the quality of the forecast. With that caveat, we did see noticeable separation this time into overperformance being associated with launches where they were meeting a clearly identifiable patient unmet need, and there was more differentiation in the profile. Those that were more Me Too, less differentiated, had a harder time, not surprisingly, perhaps standing out from the crowd in this era of reduced access. There's a question, on the panel around, or on the chat for the panel around, do we think there would be more of a novel launch model? So are we going to see perhaps changes in future launches just around much more efficient? I think a question that I know I received from a number of biotech executives is, can we launch with a digital only launch? And I think what the data we looked at with that is you can, in some cases you have to during COVID, at least temporarily. But usually I think the view is that's maybe the best you can do under those circumstances, but not the ideal under an ideal world where you would want to have, digital in addition to that personal engagement model through a combination of in-person and virtual. But curious, maybe we'll go back to Liz on this one. Do we think kind of novel launch models, maybe see more of that in the future, either access led or without that kind of field team type of engagement?
I think you're right. I think as we mentioned before, you'll see a hybrid, and I also feel it that same way about how the working conditions. I think companies will go back to a hybrid, but I still think that you'll have your personal engagement. I do think you made a comment about MSLs. I think particularly in areas like rare disease and oncology, you need that medical education. Physicians want to have a peer-to-peer discussion. So I think what you'll have is maybe an increase in those areas as you sort of balance it off with your sales team. So you really have to have a balance. But I absolutely believe that that's the case. But what's going to happen is physicians are going to go back, their practices are going to get busy, patients are going to go back in. So I don't believe that you can go to a fully virtual launch. What I do believe, though, is that once you're established, I actually think you can do more virtual engagement. And that was something I tried a few years ago that actually worked. And I think people were a little bit trepidatious about it, is if you've got it, later in your life cycle, you can pull back a little bit on the sales team. And because it's more about reminders. But as you're launching innovative products and you've got data that you need to have a discussion with a physician, I think you're still going to need that kind of hybrid model. But I do think, as we've talked about before, depending on how physicians react and what happens, assuming that they continue to be willing to engage, and I think they will, assuming they still want to engage virtually, I think we'll continue the hybrid model.
Okay, that's fantastic. And to comment on the chat that it may be, somewhat disease call point specific. I think, probably that's true. More targeted, maybe different than, in a larger, more mass market type of indication. Also may depend a bit on the competitive landscape in terms of which of those promotional and educational levers are going to be the most impactful and important. So,
sure,
yeah,
absolutely.
And that in some respects is the kind of the paradox that you face when you come into Europe, if you're a company out of the US, and especially if you're playing into the rare orphan disease space, that maybe there's just kind of a relatively small number of centers that you can target in any given country. But at the same time, you still have to go through all that challenge of going through the entire HTA process and demonstrating the value associated with your asset, and making sure making sure the clinical guys have done their work, so that the really strong clinical data is going to be there, that's going to give you optimal pricing. And I think this is where a lot of certainly, the conversations that I've had recently with US biopharmas who are thinking about out licensing Europe. This is one of the things that they come to, is that vanishingly rare diseases or conditions. It's actually very hard, unless you've done the right clinical studies, to actually get a decent price in Europe for those. And and even us as a company that already has the boots on the ground and has the infrastructure and is able to commercialize those assets, sometimes we just have to say, sorry guys, this is not for us, because the economics just don't work out. We built this business to address unmet medical needs for patients with these rare and debilitating conditions, and it almost becomes impossible for us to be able to launch particular assets just purely because of the economic environment here, and that's unlikely to get better given the macroeconomic impact of the pandemic.
That's a great point.
Yeah, Ben,
go ahead,
Liz.
Just
to add to that, I actually think that's something we all need to pay a lot of attention to. What's going to happen is patients around the world may not have access to important advances in medicine if we can't solve this problem. I don't know what the answer is, but I know we need to solve the problem, because if companies can't extract the value, well, that's what you'll see. You'll see medicines not become available and patients not have access. And that, to me, would be a tragedy.
I agree with you. We're living in the greatest level of innovation that we've ever seen in humankind's history right now, I think, and it's only going to get more too. But so, Nassim, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think we're already there in different countries. And I think the future is already in front of us. It's just segmented right now. And I think that's the big challenge ahead. And it's bigger than the pharmaceutical industry. It's around the whole of delivery of healthcare. And where does innovative products fit into that? So that's a big challenge ahead for all of us in this industry.
So we're down to a few minutes. I want to, Nassim, you had mentioned you learned some things you might do differently. I think everyone looks at benchmarks, and I always caution, well, even if you find really good ones, you got to make a kind of a point of view around whether what they did was good, bad, or indifferent, or it was just what they happened to do, right? And so can you talk a little bit about, maybe some lessons learned?
I think, look, it was a startup company, so they wanted to run very quickly and get approval as quickly as possible. And I think, to Kieran's point, the clinical data had to catch up. And so we launched with our arm behind our back. But, we were able to navigate a decent position, maybe not an optimal position. And if we were doing it all again, and we had more patients, we might have done it differently. But we were fortunate that we had that opportunity in the US to do a proper phase 3 trial and go in with real data.
Kieran, any thoughts?
Absolutely. This whole issue of the holistic view, you start thinking about your market access when you've got an asset in preclinical. You've got to think about how are you going to actually develop this product to maximize the value to your shareholders. And, if you don't do that at a super early stage in the development process, you may end up getting your fingers burned by bringing an asset through, getting it approved, but finding that you'll never get anybody to pay for it because the data just doesn't stack up. And a lot of companies have had assets approved on surrogate endpoints, and trying to convince payers that surrogate endpoints are robust and worth paying for is getting an increasingly tough call.
Liz, anything you do differently?
No, I think it's about generation of data. It's absolutely about generating more data, having the data you need. That is the most important thing, and that's what I would do differently. I would have done more, and I would have done my clinical studies a little different.
Yep. Benefits of hindsight always are great. So. Panel, this has been fantastic. We are approaching the end of our session here. I just wanted to say thank you to the three of you very much for participating, joining this conversation today. It's one I never get tired of talking about, and wish all three of you success in your own ventures and continuing to drive innovation and benefit to patients in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Ben. And yeah, huge thank you to Kieran, to Liz and to Nassim for that session. There are still questions still coming through on the chat and Q&A function. So please do keep the conversation going. I'm sure Ben would be very happy to follow up with you. I know some have requested the slides, so please do email Ben to get those slides. As I said, they're fantastic. So full of so much great data as well. So yeah, please do keep the conversations going. Invite you to also go to the ZS booth and all of our other partners who have made the event possible to sort of find out and get the advice and expertise that you need. We are back in 5 minutes now for our next session, which focuses on innovation regulation, what developers and investors need to know, and then we'll be rounding off our content session for the World Congress at 5 o'clock with a presentation from the former Chief Medical Officer of the US Medicaid Program, Challenges and Technology Solutions for Dual Eligible Populations in the US. So yeah, we're rounding off our day nicely. A huge thank you again to Liz, Nassim, Kieran and to Ben for guiding us through this session, and see you all shortly in 5 minutes.